This is our Simondon reading group. We're continuing our reading of Individuation, Volume 2. We are sort of just beginning the early modern section. So we finished the medieval section last time. Let me get the PDF open because I didn't do that before. So we saw some different versions of the opposition between different ways of defining the relationship of the human individual and God in medieval philosophy. And then in particular, there were these sort of late medieval questions about the theory of motion and the introduction of this impetus theory of motion, which is sort of an alternative to the Aristotelian theory, and that defines the source of motion as an impetus, or there's a sort of transfer of what we would now call kinetic energy from the cause of the motion to the moving object, and so this is opposed to the Aristotelian theory, in which the motion has to always be brought about by something moving in order for the motion to occur. And so the key difficulty for the Aristotelian theory was how to account for the motion of projectiles like an arrow or a cannonball. You have to come up with some sort of complicated account where the air separates in front of the projectile and then pushes the projectile from behind, or something along those lines. Whereas on the impetus theory, it's the arrow or the cannon or whatever that imparts motion to the object, and the object continues in motion until air resistance and the force of gravity make it stop. And this also opened up the possibility of seeing the motion of the planets and of the solar system as being essentially the same as the motion of a projectile. Whereas for Aristotle and for the Aristotelian tradition, the motion of the planets is a sort of natural motion, whereas the motion of a projectile is a violent motion. So it's sort of a counter-natural motion. And so this impetus theory, it might seem like a sort of a technical point of theory of motion, but it has some pretty significant ontological consequences in terms of making the supralunar world, the world of the planets and the stars, sort of homogeneous with the sublunar world, the world of earthly motions. So there's just one sort of kind of motion that is the same on Earth as it is in the heavens. And so the whole universe is sort of ontologically homogeneous. It's all sort of on the same plane, as opposed to in the Aristotelian theory, there's a sort of ontological distinction between the sublunar world and the supralunar world. So this we talked about this in some detail last time, and then we also saw Meister Eckhart, who was I think 14th century mystic, who has this account of the unification of the individual with God. This sort of there's an account in which the separation of the individual from God is a kind of illusion, and so by sort of grasping this illusion or realizing the illusory nature of individuality, the individual is capable of union with God, or sort of eliminating this illusion of separation from God. And Simondon argues that there's a kind of analogy, I guess, between this idea of the individual as being united with God in Eckhart's doctrine on the one hand, and then the sort of impetus theory, or the new physics that develops in the 14th century, that likewise, because both of them have a sort of naturalistic bent, in the sense that they don't require some sort of mediation between the individual and what the individual knows, whether the mediation of the church in the religious sphere, or mediation through the tradition in the sphere of physics. So each of them has a sort of immediate knowledge of the object known. And so there's a kind of analogy, even though they're very different, of course, between the mystical doctrine of Eckhart and the new physics of impetus that arises around the same time. And then, for some strange reason, Simondon skips over the Renaissance, so he doesn't talk at all about Galileo or about Giordano Bruno, who are also obviously very important in sort of the transition away from the medieval Aristotelian worldview to the early modern Cartesian and later Newtonian worldview. So he skips over the Renaissance and he goes, he does this little transition section into the 17th century. And so that's what we'll get to today.
I can read this section.
Yeah.
From the Renaissance to the 17th century, or I guess after, it's not itself, but starts afterwards. The problem of individuality appears in a new way in the 17th century. The spirit of individualism in the 16th century and the Renaissance comes to a close. Nevertheless, we do not find in the 17th century a return to a doctrine prior to the Renaissance. The individual always remains principal, to the extent that the individual is what is distinguished from any community, tradition, or de facto situation. But the individual is the principle of universality, the starting point and milieu of a constructive activity. It is no longer the individual qua particular being that is a reality, but the individual grasped as human being. The earthly ideal of the honest man who is not offended by anything takes on significance here. The honest man is not particularly the court gentleman, the townsman, or the countryman. Even less is he the professional man. That is because these three particular aspects, which make man belong to what we call a social milieu, take away from him something of his universality. The same can be said for inner man and character traits. A given habit, a given character type, instead of accusing an individual nature, are defects that deprive this individual of an access to the universal. To be singularized or specified is to be deprived of universality. This search for universality at the level of the individual and through the individual can also be highlighted more positively by the creation of a veritable de facto universality between scientists and the most distinguished minds. The correspondence between philosophers and scientists of the 17th century goes directly from individual to individual, external to these limited groups that constitute universities. As Emile Brahe notes, the philosophers of the 17th century did not belong to any school. Bacon, Descartes, Hobbes, Spinoza, Malebranche, Leibniz, Locke are independent from the university. These men are well known by themselves and not as members of a group. One of the most remarkable representatives of this individual independence of 17th century philosophers and scientists is Marae Mercen, who played a galvanizing role for his research before the existence of scientific media. Pascal says of him, quote, "He provided the occasion for several wonderful discoveries that perhaps would not have occurred if he had not excited scientists," unquote. Mercen made it possible for Descartes to preserve his solitude while remaining in communication with the best minds of the time. Difficulties were often proposed in the form of a problem, for example, the difficulties of geometry, and the responses were circulated by particular correspondences. Later, this function was fulfilled by scientific journals, like the Journal des Savants and the Nouvelle de la République des Lettres, as well as the Mémoire de Travaux and the Acta Eruditorum. In the same way, the academies, like the Académie des Sciences, the Accademia de Lincei, the Cimento, the Royal Society of London, the Berlin-Brandenburg Academy of Sciences and Humanities constitute societies that are essentially groupings of individuals who think and communicate their works and discoveries qua individuals, without there being a group opinion that constituting a dogma. The goal of these societies is to realize a universality of information, not to decide on what is true and false. The statutes of the Royal Society of London are quite remarkable in this regard. The society will not make its own any hypothesis, this is a quote, any doctrine on the principles of natural philosophy proposed or mentioned by any philosopher whatsoever, whether ancient or modern, unquote. And this is so as, quote, not to give as general certain thoughts which are particular to them, unquote. I guess I'll just read to the end of this page. This thought defines a universal condition of individuality. The individual is capable of universality, not in the empirical conditions of his existence, but in the exercise of his activity. The individual is universalized by his activity. The thinkers of the 17th century abandoned the dynamism of the 16th century and the Renaissance, but it seems that everything removed from the world is given to the thinking subject. This constructive order of universality indeed starts with the individual to such an extent that all objects of the world and their relations are posited as reconstructible by thought. If the dynamism of the 16th century is abandoned, this is because the original connection between man and the world, the barrier and a link still remain. The apprehension of the object here is even more immediate than in the dynamism of the preceding age. The object is grasped as compenetrable to a technics, which is the rational reconstruction of the real and the extension of the creative work through self-aware human power. There's no longer a distinction between reason and intelligence. What can be thought is that which can be constructed or that which constructs. I guess I was a little bit confused by this insistence on the idea of the individual being individuated by connection to the universal, maybe in light of some of the stuff about medieval philosophy we were reading, where often a problem was being able to adequately describe or provide for the particularity of individuals, where the only reality, or maybe the domain with the most reality, was the specific. So it seems like there's a kind of conflict or tension between the individual as individual and universal.
Right. I think part of what Simondon sees as this transition from the medieval schema of participation to the early modern schema of construction, which we'll see more on as we continue. I think part of what he sees this transition as containing or implying is that the individual becomes the sort of principle in a different way compared to how it was in medieval philosophy. So yeah, you're right. In medieval philosophy, one of the sort of problems that constantly recurs is how to have an intellectual grasp on the individual. In particular, if our knowledge is knowledge of universals, it's difficult to understand how exactly we can have knowledge of an individual. Like if we know an entity because it's a horse and it's brown and it's etc. All the different properties we can attribute to this entity are all universals, and then explaining how we can actually know this entity, this particular horse, is sort of a difficult problem. Whereas in the 17th century, as Simondon was describing it here, universality is a kind of it's a universality of the subject in a different way, as opposed to a universality of knowledge. So it's because the subject is not is not sort of limited to a particular sphere, that the subject has the capacity for universal knowledge, and so in particular, the subject should not be like a professional who belongs to a sort of limited sphere, whether it's the profession of medicine or law or serving in the court, for example. Any of these sort of professions limit the sphere of action or the sphere of knowledge of the individual, and the individual should be here. I think there's a bit of a translation issue, because in the translation it says that the honest man, and that's sort of a literal translation of l'honnête homme. But I think the better translation would be something like a decent man or even a gentleman. There's this notion of the gentleman as someone who is not sort of confined to any one particular sphere of thought or action, and because of that, they can have knowledge without sort of the partiality that is implicit in any of those particular spheres of action. And this was sort of the ideal of the these different academies of sciences that appear in the 17th century in different countries. It's this idea that through this interaction of these gentlemen who are not sort of partial to any particular theory or any particular school of thought, this interaction will bring about will bring about a sort of approximation towards the truth, or by interacting with others who are not partial, you get closer and closer to the truth. So I think that this is sort of what Simondon sees as the what's new about this 17th century conception of the individual. It's this sort of non-partiality of knowledge is what is essential to the universality of the subject in the 17th century.
Thanks, that makes sense. One other thing I wanted to say about this section is we were talking before we started recording about the Solvay conference and the way that played out with the dominance of the Copenhagen interpretation. But it seems like one of the things that Simondon likes about these scientific societies here is that they are impartial in a way that maybe the group that ended up supporting exclusively the Copenhagen interpretation was not in the early 20th century. This also makes me think of his earlier comments about like the technician as the individual with direct knowledge that is not kind of socially mediated, direct knowledge of the object.
Yeah, I think the comparison with the Solvay conference is interesting because the participants in the Solvay conference are definitely not bound to something like this rule of impartiality. These societies of the 17th century, there's sort of a distinction of levels of like at the level of the society as a whole. The society does not endorse any particular scientific or philosophical theory. It's just sort of a medium for transmitting different opinions or different positions and allowing them to sort of confront each other. And then at the level of like there's still sort of a space for schools to appear. Different schools will propose different doctrines and argue for their position and try to convince others and so on. It's not like the scientists of the 17th century are sort of neutral on different scientific questions. It's that the society serves only as a sort of medium to transmit these different positions. And then in the 20th century, like in the Solvay conference, this role of the sort of medium of transmission is played more by scientific journals and as opposed to something like this society. Like there are, of course, the American Association of Physicists or what is it? The American Physics Association, I think, is the name, and other institutions, societies of scientists of various kinds that exist today. But I think they don't play exactly the same role that they did in the 17th century of sort of serving as the medium of transmission of information and ideas between scientists. And then I think your point about the technician is an interesting one too, because it's precisely the technician who is sort of thought of in the 17th century as being like sort of emblematic of someone who is particularized, who is not this sort of gentleman who can have this impartial knowledge or non-partial knowledge. The technician or someone who is sort of confined to a particular trade or a particular skill set is someone who has only a partial knowledge. They might have detailed knowledge of metalworking, for example, but they won't know anything about chemistry or whatever other field of knowledge is relevant to a particular question. And so there was a sort of devalorization of technical knowledge at the same time as a sort of as we'll see with Bacon, as when we get to that section, there's a kind of utopian idea of how scientific knowledge will allow for greater technical capacity to control nature, but at the same time, the actual people who are involved in the technical knowledge of the time are sort of devalorized as being confined to a particular trade. So there's a kind of tension, I guess, between two different aspects of technical knowledge. On the one hand, it sort of confines you to a particular trade and makes you partial in that sense. And then on the other hand, it's sort of one of the consequences of scientific knowledge that is valorized by 17th century writers.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and so we see this like this sort of criticism of partiality is also tied to the criticism of the university or the schools, as they would often call them at the time. And so, as Simondon points out here, most of the sort of main philosophers that are still read today or who are still considered important today were not members of the university. They were sort of private individuals who did their researches and publications outside of the university setting, and so the school, the university, was considered to be a sort of partial environment or a sort of partial standpoint on knowledge, in the same way as a technical specialization would be. So being a scholar in a university was a kind of limiting approach to knowledge, or a limiting position to reach knowledge, as opposed to being a private gentleman who conducts their own researches and does their own investigation of different scientific questions. Okay, so let's go on to the next bit of this section. I think, I'll read the rest of the section. It's just over a page. Okay. Operation has the value... Oh, sorry, I missed a sentence. To construct is to arrange, and to arrange is to construct. Operation has the value of being. It not only modifies being, it constitutes being. The individual is the being who can construct or reconstruct himself. Action upon oneself is no longer conceived as a purification or a sacrifice, but as a construction that takes stock and takes back up reality initially given as a whole in order to rearrange it and complete it. The activity of constructive discovery that the Renaissance has mainly dedicated to the world turned back toward itself in the 17th century, but the self is not conceived as something to be explored. It is grasped as a reality to be constructed or reconstructed according to norms elaborated in the most fruitful rational techniques, that of mathematics applied to mechanics. What the 17th century discovers in the sciences is that which is constructible according to technical schemas. The type of intelligibility is that of a mechanical functioning in which there is no anteriority of the whole with respect to the parts. The order of the parts is what gives to the whole the functioning that characterizes it. The functioning is a relation or ensemble of relations. Structures are mechanical structures, not hierarchies, hidden forces, desires, or even analogies, a relation between sign and signified thing. The individual is a being without subjectivity, or at least without profound intimacy. Essence becomes activity. Relation is a bundle of operations, and structure is a bundle of relations. Certain difficulties undoubtedly persist in this endeavor. The human individual is not simple, and not everything within him is constructible to the same degree. One of the fundamental relations that is revealed in him is imposed as a given reality that does not allow him to be penetrated directly by any schematism. The intelligibility of the human individual has been obtained only by supposing the distinction between soul and body. The whole irrationality of the given has been repressed in this obscure relation that is not a bundle of operation. Therein lies the paradox of individuality in the particular form that it takes in the 17th century. The individual becomes something constructible and consequently rational, on condition that one supposes realized a certain discontinuity that has broken individual unity and is not constructible in any way, since it supposes a theory of being that is different from a theory that makes rational construction possible. It in fact supposes that there can be relation across an ontological discontinuity, a bisubstantial heterogeneity, whereas every rationalism of the constructive order depends on the hypothesis of the continuity and homogeneity of being. Nowhere is this paradox more visible than in Descartes, but the difficulty he presents is so massive that none of the great systematic thinkers of the century escape his domination. I think that should be escape its domination. In this age, the schema of participation is abandoned so as to think the individual. The schema of construction replaces it and comes up against the same fundamental problem. So this is a good question from Angus in the chat here. Is rational constructibility supposed to apply to extension here and not thought? I think the idea is that both extension and thought should be something constructible, or it's insofar as something is constructible that it can be understood. And so in the realm of extension, this means that you focus on simple machines and mechanics as mathematized mechanics, in the post-Galilean tradition, is sort of the core of science. And then in the realm of thought, it means that you have to have as we'll see with Descartes, you have to be able to construct a chain of reasoning that is evident at every step. And so you start from something immediately or intuitively obvious, and then you sort of proceed through reasoning from one item or one object of thought that is immediately obvious to another that is sort of has a derived evidence or a derived obviousness. And so I think each side of the opposition between extension and thought is supposed to be constructible, or what we can know in each of these domains is the constructible. Yeah, so this so in this last bit, Simondon points to the relationship between thought and extension, or in particular between the body and the soul in the human being, as being sort of the core problem of 17th century thought. And so he says that everything that's sort of irrational or obscure or hard to understand is kind of bundled together into this one sort of mysterious relationship between the body and the soul. And so this is especially in the Cartesian doctrine, a central point of difficulty. And Descartes, I think this is probably a merit of his, is that he acknowledges that this is a difficulty, and he says that actually the union of the body and the soul is something that surpasses human understanding. It's God brings it about through an individual sort of action of will, and it's something that humans can't understand. And so it's Descartes is honest about the fact that this is something obscure in his theory, and he doesn't sort of pretend that it's something obvious or something comprehensible. But this is sort of not just a Cartesian problem, but a sort of 17th century problem in general. And the various different thinkers of the 17th century propose different solutions or different interpretations of how the body and the soul interact, or what the relationship is between body and soul. And so this is sort of the core point of obscurity, where each side, the extension and the human body, are in principle understandable through mathematical mechanics, even if the details of how the human body works are not fully understood. And the soul is understandable through rational constructibility in the same way. So you can sort of perform these chains of reasoning, but it's the interaction or the point of connection between the two that remains obscure. And so I think we can compare this to Simondon's analysis and criticism of the hylomorphic doctrine in Volume 1, where he argues that the weakness or the difficulty in the hylomorphic doctrine is precisely the interaction between form and matter. There's this obscure zone in the middle where the form of a brick sort of is supposed to be imposed on the mass of clay, but the actual interaction between the form and the clay is kind of left out of the theory. And we can see likewise here that the soul and the body are each sort of understood in their own terms, but the actual interaction of the two is something that has to be sort of filled in by a miracle, or is kind of left as this obscure zone.
I can read Francis Bacon.
Yeah. How long is it? I think it's Let's just read a page or so because it's about 2.5 pages.
Okay. Francis Bacon. With Bacon, the constructive intention stands out. Oh yeah, God, there are like 15 Latin titles here. The constructive intention stands out in the temporis partus masculus sive de interpretatione naturae. The fifth and sixth parts of the treatise reveal how one can descend back from the laws of the sciences to the actions that these knowledges allow to exert over nature. The study of phenomena universi makes it possible to found scientia activa. Between the first study, which is the Historia Naturalis sive experimentalis ad condendum philosophiam, and the Philosophia secunda sive scientia activa, is inserted the Scala Intellectus sive filum laborenti, and the Prodromi sive anticipationes philosophiae secundae. This plan is already that of the Cartesian reform, albeit without the cogito. Bacon wants to transform human life by ensuring the mastery of man over nature. Descartes will add the mastery of man over himself by establishing continuity between the techniques that guarantee mastery over nature and those that make it possible to arrive at self-mastery in the unity that wisdom is. In this sense, technical objects are not conceived as different from natural beings. Natural history is divided into 3 parts. Historia generationum, Praeter generationem, and artium. Study of monsters and technics was already part of the encyclopedia elaborated by Pliny, but unlike Bacon, Pliny does not assert that monsters and techniques reveal the same forces as those hidden in natural generations. Natura omnia regit. Nature rules all things. Man does not create any force that is not in nature. He only creates new conditions. Human operation is the value of being. It is natural and enters the universality of natural actions. There's no longer a fundamental distinction between the theoretical order and the practical order. Practical operations are not merely part of the operations of nature. They're capable of being considered as objects of theoretical study. It is thereby understood why there is continuous passage from the first philosophy to second philosophy. It is thereby understood why it is possible, without doing harm to first philosophy, to, quote, call back the natural philosophy from the 1,000 forms of speculation to the importance of operative practices. Bacon turns away from the sciences of argumentation because these sciences are enclosed in the specialty of a method or a vocabulary. Scholastics, quote, enclose their souls in Aristotle, just as they lock their bodies in their cells, unquote. These specialists take refuge in their discipline and are under the illusion that their favorite science contains all things. Maybe I'll stop there.
Yeah, that's a good place to stop. So Bacon is one of the sort of core ideas that Simondo brings out here is the use of knowledge. Knowledge should bring about power over nature. So our scientific knowledge of the world should allow human beings to control nature and serve human ends. And this is certainly a different conception of knowledge compared to Aristotelian and medieval conceptions of knowledge. So Aristotle, famously argues that the speculative life is the best life for the human being. And speculation or theory, like the term theory, the Greek word is a word for seeing. So it's a kind of I don't want to say passive operation because it's something that the subject has to do to theorize, but it's a kind of non-transformative knowing. It knows the world through seeing the world as it is, as opposed to sort of bringing about transformations in the world. And this is sort of the conception of knowledge that is sort of predominant throughout the medieval period, is that knowledge is primarily a speculative activity, whereas Bacon wants to sort of return from this speculative conception of knowledge to a practical conception of knowledge. So we know something insofar as we're capable of using that aspect of the world to bring about effects that are beneficial to achieving particular aims that we might have. And the other bit that Simondon brings out here is that sort of homogeneity that we talked about a little bit in connection with the impetus theory. So likewise here, there's a sort of homogenization, I guess, of the natural world. Everything is subject to the same laws of nature, and that includes human technical arts, technical skills. Our technological productions are governed by the laws of nature, and so our knowledge is applied in our technical productions. And so this is another sort of key point in Bacon that is opposed to the medieval understanding of knowledge.
I read the question concerning technology a couple months ago, and obviously Heidegger argues that there's this new kind of mode of being that arises somewhere in like the early modern period, which entails this understanding of nature as something to be mastered, which I think he typically, at least as I understand it, kind of associates with Descartes. But maybe on Simondon's reading, Bacon would be a more appropriate starting point, although I think he also thinks that this relationship of mastery, towards going from the human to nature is kind of reversible.
Yeah, we find similar statements in Descartes to the effect that knowledge should bring about mastery over nature. So there's a continuity from Bacon to Descartes. They have similar conceptions of the relation between knowledge and the natural world. But yeah, Simondon makes the remark here, if I can just find it. So the in Descartes, what's different is that there's not only a mastery of the human being over nature through knowledge, but also a mastery of the human being over themselves through knowledge. So he has this treatise on the passions that sort of articulates a theory of how the human being is affected by other entities and suffers passions like jealousy or anger or whatever as a result of being affected in various ways by different entities, and how the rational being can sort of control those passions and sort of preserve their dispassionate intellectual nature. But I think that conception of nature as something to be mastered is something we can attribute both to Descartes and to Bacon. They both have a similar conception, and it's through both of them, I think, that it comes to be a predominant conception in the Western world of the relationship between knowledge and nature. And one other point too is we see here right at the top of 558 how Bacon criticizes the scholastic doctrine as being a sort of partiality, that the scholars in the schools in the Aristotelian tradition are sort of locked up into one particular doctrine and are not capable of serving as the sort of universal subject that Bacon thinks is required to have knowledge of the natural world. And so this is sort of calling back to the point that Simondon was making in the introduction to this section, or the transition to this section, about how the gentleman is a kind of universal subject who is not enclosed into the partiality of a particular school.
Seems like Bacon seems like a kind of, I heard that the Copenhagen school is referred to as like the shut up and calculate way of thinking about complementarity or wave particle relation. And it seems like Bacon has a similar kind of practically oriented and attitude that is somewhat hostile to just pure theory.
Yeah, and this also manifests in his epistemology, as we'll see a little bit as we continue, because Bacon has a purely inductive epistemology. He thinks that you just sort of conduct a bunch of experiments, and the true account is sort of forms automatically just by observing multiple different experiments, and so he doesn't have any place in his epistemology for theory construction of developing an account of how this phenomenon is produced. It's just sort of an automatic process of producing the grasp of the phenomenon through repetition of multiple different experiments. So yeah, there's definitely an anti-theoretical sort of bent to Bacon's thought. Okay, so let's go on to the next bit. I think I'll read the rest of this section because it's a bit more than a page. Let's see, where are we? Right. The sterility of dogmatic specializations is explained by this enclosure. Sterility is a sign of the unreality of thought. Scholastic logic is sterile, like a virgin consecrated to God. It produces nothing. In its isolation, the mind can only produce distinction upon distinction. In this way, isolated man possesses nothing but intellectus sibi permissus, the intellect left to itself. What Bacon seeks is operative fruitfulness, and he thinks that he can find it only in experiment. He remains quite different from Descartes by not discovering a condition of fruitfulness for the intellectus sibi permissus, or rather by not distinguishing inventive and synthetic deductive labor from simple logical analysis. But the intention is the same, to refuse the fruitlessness of pure formalism. It is up to the individual being to not let himself become locked into the illusion of a completed dogma like the scholastics, and to go, for Bacon, toward experiment, and for Descartes, toward constructive deduction. Nevertheless, Bacon is still much closer to the Renaissance than Descartes. For Bacon, the dynamism in the world is found deposited in the human being, but it still partially remains deposited in the world, such that, in experiment, a certain relation always remains maintained between the individual and the world. Bacon ignores the inventive capacity of deduction. In this sense, he is the pioneer of this confidence in the capacity of the individual being that will be found in Descartes. He does not yet have the methods that will fertilize and validate the confidence in this capacity, but he has faith in this force, and his intention will be pursued by Descartes with new means. Bacon has not sufficiently discovered the methods of universality to be able to fully justify the confidence in the individual who invents. In the domain of 17th century thought, the absolute individuality of thought can only be discovered with the universality of method. The paradox of individuality seeking itself through the awareness of its means of action upon nature is revealed in Bacon through the twofold appearance of man's relation to the world. Natura non vincitur nisi parendo. Nature to be commanded must be obeyed. Furthermore, this omnipotence of creative man is not expressed by an individualist ethics, but by a theory that subordinates the good of the individual to the good of society, of which he is a part. The sovereign good must not be sought in the tranquility of the individual's soul, but in the active good radiating out from his works. The science of man ends with a politics distinct from morality, politics which is above all a doctrine of the state and power, founded on facts according to the spirit of Machiavelli. Ultimately, this quest for universality is explained in physics by mechanism, which Bacon uses at the end of induction to discover the explanation of the properties of a thing in the nature of a phenomenon. It is the latent schematism that explains the properties of a body. Everything qualitative and connected to the particularity of a given body in a determined circumstance is thereby eliminated. The essence of each thing is in a permanent geometrical and mechanical structure that is common to several beings and to all beings or phenomena with the same properties. It is the community of actions that allows us to consider phenomena as identical. There is no participation, but solely identity in reality, i.e. in structures that produce a given function, a given operation. Universality is in the operation and the structure that conditions it, not in particularity. Even the study of final causes is much too external to the physical being and remains the sterile virgin that Bacon indicates. The physical being is itself only by having a structure in which everything that could designate it as a particular being disappears. The same simultaneous presence of the extreme aspects of individual reality is exhibited in Bacon's mechanism. This quest for universality is still exhibited in the manner in which Boyle, continuing Bacon's thought, critiques Descartes' mechanism as overly particular. Quote, the mechanical explanation that Descartes gives to qualities depends so much on his particular notions of a subtle matter, of globules of the second element, and other similar things, and he has interwoven these notions so much with the rest of his hypothesis that one can hardly make use of it unless one adopts his philosophy in full. Unquote. Boyle, on the contrary, finds a more perfect universality in uniquely experimental considerations, i.e. in the mathematical science of machines, which allows us, quote, to apply pure mathematics to the production or modifications of movements in bodies, unquote. Right, so here we see a little bit about what I was mentioning earlier about this purely inductive epistemology in Bacon. So there's no role for the intellect left to itself for theorizing or for deductive reasoning in science. It's only through experiment and through sort of repeated observation of phenomena that the scientists can come to a grasp of the phenomenon and an understanding of the phenomenon that allows for mastery over nature. And there's no place within this theory for within this account of knowledge for theorizing or for deduction. And this sort of privileging of observation also goes along with the sort of desire for universality, as the last bit of this section indicates. So the criticism that so Boyle is a sort of Baconian in the sense that he criticizes Descartes for producing a theory that you have to sort of accept as a whole or reject as a whole. So Descartes' explanation of various phenomena is such that you can't really accept the explanation of that he gives of the formation of a rainbow or the operation of the human heart or whatever physical phenomenon. You can't accept that explanation unless you sort of take on the whole apparatus that Descartes proposes, his theory of physics with the subtle matter and the different types of particles that interact with each other through mechanical means and so on. And so this theory, this Cartesian theory, is a sort of partial theory. It makes you sort of it confines the scientist or the philosopher into one particular doctrine, as opposed to a more sort of liberal conception of mechanical philosophy that allows for explanations of phenomena that you can accept or reject sort of one at a time and not be locked into one particular philosophical doctrine. And then you can investigate each phenomenon independently of the others.
In this part of the section you just read, Simondon seems to suggest that it's Bacon's emphasis on experiment that keeps him from falling into kind of pure bisubstantiality in the way that Descartes will. Maybe that's something that's only possible for like deductive method as opposed to an inductive one. There's still kind of a connection to the world in Bacon in a way that there isn't in Descartes.
Yeah, so Bacon has so Simondon points out that Bacon is closer to the Renaissance than Descartes is, and I think what he has in mind is that for Bacon, material entities or matter as such has active powers. So there's heat, and heat is a capacity to warm other objects, right? Anything hot has the power to heat other entities, and weight and various chemical properties. All of these properties of matter are active powers that material bodies have for Bacon. Whereas for Descartes, it's matter is equal to extension. It's just this sort of inert geometrical entity that it only acts on other entities through contact, and it has no sort of inherent powers of its own. And so the Baconian theory of knowledge, this inductive theory of knowledge, is a sort of extension of this conception of material objects as having power. So this sort of dynamism of material objects includes this sort of dynamism of knowledge of those material objects. So it's like the idea of a magnet or whatever has dynamic properties in the same way that the magnet itself has dynamic properties, and so the just through observation and experiment, by having this experience of these phenomena sort of accumulate, they interact with each other and bring about the mastery over that phenomenon in the human mind. And so there's no need for something like a deductive theory that would sort of bring about that motion and interaction of ideas like there is for Descartes. There's a sort of internal dynamism of the ideas of entities, because those entities are dynamic in themselves. And so I think that's sort of what Simondo has in mind when he talks about Bacon being closer to the Renaissance.
Thank you. That makes sense.
Yeah, sorry, there's an echo here. The mechanical philosophy consists to a large extent in trying to explain these powers of material objects in mechanical terms, but there's like a sort of I guess a difference in emphasis between Bacon and Descartes, in that Descartes wants to sort of reduce all of these material powers to motion of extended objects of matter conceived as identical with extension. And he ultimately thinks that all the powers, heat and color and taste and all these other properties that material objects have are sort of are secondary qualities, that they only show how the object affects our body. They don't. They're not properties of the object themselves. So entities in themselves don't have a color or a taste or anything. It's only color and taste are effects of various bodies on the human body that the soul perceives. Whereas for Bacon, even though he wants to use mechanics and mechanical explanation to achieve a grasp of natural phenomena, he doesn't want to sort of reduce the powers of material entities to a purely mechanical operation. He wants to understand those powers of material entities sort of in mechanical terms, without that reduction, or without saying that those powers are illusory or are only a result of the action of the entity on the human body. Okay, the section on Descartes is pretty long. I don't know if you want to start it today. We won't be able to finish it today, but do you want to start it today and then finish it next time, or do you want to see if we can get through the whole thing next time?
Sorry, let me just... Maybe you want to start it today, because I think it might be longer than we can get through in a single session. Maybe even if we just get a couple pages into it.
Sure. Yeah, let's do that. Okay. Do you want to read the first page or so then?
Yes. Descartes. We also find in Descartes the, quote, project of a universal science that can elevate our nature to its highest degree of perfection, unquote. But a new source of universality is found in the deductive method that does not require the individual to resort to experiment and does not force his thought to obey nature to dominate it. Descartes realizes an absolute independence of the individual being, so as to be able to attain the condition of universality in this independence. The individual gesture attains to the universal when the conditions under which it is accomplished are conditions of universality. These conditions are the conditions of certain knowledge through the universality of the negative proofs of the validity of knowledge. The universal is that which, of the individual being, has resisted the progressive ordeal of doubt. If we study how doubt is organized, we see that it proceeds from what is particular, personal, to the generality of concepts, and ultimately to the universal and necessary knowledge of mathematical notions and of demonstrations or operations. Doubt is possible on all these levels, but in order for it to manage to become established, arguments of increasingly painstaking elaboration must be put forth. Doubt is even applicable to the necessary deductions and operations of mathematics. But it is singularly and paradoxically held in check when thought finally grasps as ultimate reality that of the being who thinks. The individual being is rediscovered at the end of the progress in methodical doubt, but under conditions that are totally different from those of the first grasping of the individual being by himself. The first grasping was one in which, at the end of the first meditation, Descartes wondered if we could believe in the existence of the body proper. The illusions, dreams, proprioceptive hallucinations of madmen prohibited trusting in this feeling of the existence of the body at this stage. In the second meditation is the individual being insofar as he thinks that is grasped as object of reflexive thought. However, like Kant in particular, it could be said that the Cogito indeed makes it possible to grasp the existence of a thinking activity, but not to individualize it by giving it a personal subject. The I of the Cogito would merely be the form of all judgment, and not the reality of an individualized personal being. Can this operation of the Cogito be considered to reveal an impersonal activity? Descartes, in fact, envisions the problem of the permanence of thought. Quote, I am, I exist, that is certain, but how long? Unquote. Yet he does not seem to envision the personal character of thought as a question distinct from existence. It is as if the thought discovered in the Cogito didn't need any individuation because it is already an individuated being. From the outset, this thought is an individual being due to the negative character of the ordeal. The Cogito remains faced with the evil genius who guarantees that we are wrong every time we judge I am. For this judgment to be false when it is grasped as certain, there must be a being who is distinct from the one bearing judgment, and who is more powerful than him, who makes him be wrong every time he judges. But then the subject who judges concerning his own existence, and who feels the evidence of his judgment every time he thinks, must be substantially distinct from the evil genius. If not, he would know that he were deceived, if he were to himself his own deceiver. If, by contrast, the evil genius does not exist, then the judgment is true. Yeah, I don't know. It seems like a lot of what he says at the beginning of this section is the way that he talks about this is going to be substantiated later on by the way that he talks about the operation of doubt and doubt as thought taking itself for its object.
Yeah, there's this notion of doubt is sort of the key innovation that Descartes brings into philosophy, because in ancient philosophy and medieval philosophy, there's definitely there is a skeptical school in ancient Greece that argues that we don't have knowledge through the senses or through reasoning, and tries to cultivate an indifference of opinion in opposition to all the philosophical schools. But this skeptical school is kind of marginal in the sense that other schools don't really feel like the need to refute skepticism or to concern themselves with skepticism. But what we find here with Descartes is that this doubt or overcoming doubt is sort of a core piece of what philosophy does, and so in the meditations, there's this sort of intellectual progression from doubting the senses to doubting mathematical truths, and then you arrive at the question of whether one actually exists or not, and it's at that point that the Cogito intervenes, and then everything else is sort of reconstructed on the basis of the Cogito. And so it's this conception of doubt sort of progressively extending its reach across our intellectual activities, and then the sort of reverse order, once you reach one point that is indubitable, that is not subject to doubt, that's sort of the new elements in Descartes' philosophy.
I've been taking a class on Derrida recently, just like another kind of intro class, but we reading parts of grammatology, and we read the supplement section, and this is kind of an aside, but I think you could argue that the Cogito as a substance is something that needs kind of the evil genius as the supplement, because otherwise you can't really go from the activity of doubt to the idea that there is a thinking thing behind the activity that persists through time. But as Simondon is arguing here, there's if you have this presupposition of the evil genius, which must be distinct from the subject that thinks, then that kind of shores up the substantiality of the thinking subject.
Yeah, that's interesting, because so Simondon here, he sort of alludes to Kant's criticism of the Cogito So Kant argues that in the Cogito, what we have knowledge of is just the unity of consciousness or the unity of the subject. So there's a sort of when we judge, I think the I that is thinking is a sort of formal principle of unity of consciousness, as opposed to something substantial. And then so there's what he calls a paralogism of reason, when you sort of reason on the one hand about the formal unity of consciousness, and then you sort of pass, without noticing it or without indicating it, from this formal unity of consciousness to the substantial reality of the subject as a distinct substance, that in which thinking inheres. So that's the Kantian criticism that I think is sort of underlying that comment. Because so as Simono reconstructs the argument here, there's a sort of the role of the evil genius is to sort of make this substantial reality of the subject evident, or to bring about the substantiality of the subject. So in the Cogito, we have knowledge of the existence of the entity that thinks. So whenever I think, or whenever I think I'm doubting, or whatever, I exist, as long as I think, as long as I'm thinking. But the question is whether there's a sort of substantial reality of the thinking entity from one episode of thinking to the next, and whether there's an identity across one episode of thinking to the next, and so on. And so in what the evil genius argument does is to indicate that the thinking subject or the thinking being has to have substantial reality, distinct from the evil genius. Even if the evil genius is capable of bringing about the fact that I make a mistake every time that I judge. So every time that I try to add 2 + 2 = 4, I get the wrong number, or every time I try to think whatever the most obvious truths are, I make a mistake because the evil genius sort of forces me to. But even in this scenario, the Cogito remains valid, because if the evil genius is capable of making it such that I make a mistake in judging that I think, then the evil genius has to be a distinct entity from me, a distinct substance from me. And so the thinking entity, has to be a substance. And so this is how Descartes passes from the purely formal unity of the I think to the substantial unity of the thinking thing, the res cogitans. And so this is sort of the key point of transition from the formal to the substantial. And so I think we can understand this evil genius as a kind of supplement in that sense. It's something that sort of intervenes as this moment that has to disappear in order for the whole conceptual apparatus to actually work.
Thank you. That makes sense.
Okay, so I think that's good for the section that we just read. Let's go on to the next page or so, so I can read this bit. Right, I think we're right at the bottom of 560, if I remember correctly.
Thus the Cogito.
Right, okay, thanks. Thus the Cogito is valid either if it is false in itself, because it must exist to be able to be rendered false by the action of a substantially distinct being, or if it is true due to its direct content. In the first case, it is the sum of the Cogito ergo sum that harbors personal existence. In the second case, it is the Cogito. We should note that the subject of the Cogito is not just the logical subject of the proposition, but also the real object of the evil genius's action. If the subject were merely the subject of judgment, it could not resist the falseness of judgment. However, the validity of the Cogito resists error in the judgment that constitutes it, because this judgment is not grasped only as a proposition, but also as an act, and the act conserves its reality, whether the proposition be true or false. Here the cogito provides the privileged case of a proposition whose object is the act that formulates it. This proposition therefore takes its validity from the act that posits it because it states nothing but this act. It is true absolutely. This proposition is to itself its own object and its own signification. We could say that it is automatically true by its own functioning, for it suffices unto itself. Its particularity is consequently constituted by a pure universality that is not logical but is itself a universality of being. The cogito is an absolute generation of signification and being, of essence and existence. There is coincidence of essence and existence in the cogito, just as there is coincidence of the subject who thinks and the object he thinks, i.e. himself at the instant in which he thinks himself. The cogito realizes the identity of a truth and a reality. The cogito as proposition is a real truth, just as the act that thinks the cogito is a true reality. The cogito establishes a reciprocity of truth and reality, which construct one another according to a schema of recurrent causality. This reaction, nevertheless, must be introduced under conditions such that it can be maintained. The conditions are conditions of the absolute independence of the subject who thinks. The absence of agitation and preoccupations, and then the exercise of methodical doubt create the conditions of recurrent causality. Under these conditions, which are necessary for reactivity, the cogito is defined in advance as that which can be achieved only for a totally independent individual being. It is therefore natural that Descartes does not seek to establish the personal character of the subject of the cogito, since the conditions under which the cogito is achieved are the conditions of the absolute personal independence of the being who thinks. Such as he appears in the cogito, the individual is therefore the being who expresses himself in a conscious operation. Here the logical operation of methodical doubt. The individual exists before the cogito because the condition of individuality is necessary for the entire progress of doubt. And it could be said that if doubt is not logically necessary for the proposition of the cogito, it is in some way energetically necessary for it. Individuality pre-exists as engine and subject of doubt, as requirement of certainty. Yeah, let's stop here. This is another long paragraph. Right, so here Simondon is sort of developing this notion of the cogito as the point of transition between truth and reality. So the cogito is a proposition. I think, therefore I am, is a proposition that we can entertain, that you can assert or think of. But at the same time, through the act of thinking that proposition, you in fact make it true. There's this sort of immediate connection between the truth of the proposition and the action of thinking of the proposition. And so this is a sort of unique property of the cogito as a proposition. It's a proposition that makes itself true just by virtue of being thought, whereas any other proposition, like it's raining outside, is made true by something distinct from the act of thinking it. You can think that proposition without it being true, and so this is sort of the particularity of this proposition, is that it has this sort of pure universality, that it sort of has this immediate transition between its thought and its truth, and the other sort of consequence of this is that there's no need to sort of argue for the personal reality of the entity who thinks the cogito, because it's only possible to perform the cogito and perform the whole operation of putting all of your knowledge into doubt, and then reaching the cogito as the indubitable foundation of knowledge. It's only possible to do this if you are in certain sort of intellectual conditions. You have to sort of be free from passions and the sort of partiality of the subject that we talked about earlier. You have to. It's only the person who is sort of free from all of these external considerations that can actually perform the cogito in its full sort of manifestation in the way that Descartes does in the Meditations. And so because of this, the question of whether there's a sort of personal existence of the entity who performs the cogito is kind of irrelevant. It's only a person in this sort of universal circumstance who can perform the cogito. And so there's a kind of immediate transition from the personal universality to the universality of the cogito.
For some reason, I read this as like another one of those kind of sociological points about how you can only think the cogito if you are in conditions of solitude similar to those in which Descartes was working, which he referred to back in the From the Renaissance to the 17th Century section, where he was talking about Mercen and how he made it possible for Descartes to preserve his solitude.
Yeah, I think the solitude of Descartes' work is a sort of empirical manifestation of the solitude necessary, or the independence necessary to perform the cogito in this adequate way. So to actually pursue this path of methodical doubt and put all of your knowledge into question, and then reach the cogito as the point of foundation for a new construction of knowledge. To actually do this whole intellectual exercise, you have to have the sort of independence and freedom of mind to be able to pull this off. And so the sort of the solitude in which Descartes is working is a kind of realization of this intellectual independence, as opposed to, I think, a condition for it.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, I think there's also sort of more sociological explanations of that solitude of Descartes, because he was in particular worried about the Inquisition. He saw what happened to Galileo as a result of his researches, and so he's always very careful to state his ideas in a way that doesn't conflict with church doctrine. Like in his treatise on the world, he gives a heliocentric account of the world, but he says at the beginning, this is sort of an intellectual exercise. We are sort of seeing. We want to sort of construct an account of how God might have created the world in such a way that it would present the same appearances to us as it does. And so, if we did that, we would, doing this exercise, we start from the sun as the center of the solar system, as opposed to the Earth. Just because it's a simpler hypothesis, it makes our theory simpler. But we know from church doctrine that, in fact, it's the Earth that's the center of the universe. And so he's very careful to sort of separate out this physical theory that he treats as sort of a fiction, or at least he presents as a kind of fiction, from the reality of the motion of the Earth around the sun, which he doesn't want to assert as something real, at least in that text, because he's being careful about the not conflicting with church doctrine.
I see. That is interesting. Actually, how do you feel about calling it a night here? It's kind of late here.
Yeah, sure. That works for me. Okay. That's about an hour and a half for our recording. So yeah, let's see. Where did I stop? Let me just find right top of 562. Okay. Let me see if I can figure out how to turn off these bots.
You know which line that was? Where we ended?
I think we're right at the beginning of 562, the first full sentence on 562.
Okay. My pages are slightly different.
Oh, right. Yeah. So it's
according to this principle.
Reality.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
Okay. Let's try this. Okay. I think that worked. So thanks for coming out. Thanks everyone who's listening, and hope to see you next week.